Hello, I'm John Cogan, the CEO of Proformative, the leading platform for professional development across the Office of the CFO. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event entitled The Impact of Cloud and M&A. I'd like to thank our sponsor, NetSuite, whose commitment to thought leadership in this realm helps us make today's educational webinar possible and delivered at no cost to the participants. With many M&A transactions, the problem remains the same, the ongoing management of core financials. Leveraging a cloud-based ERP is a practical alternative to the traditional on-premise or hosted solutions that many organizations have embraced in the past, and we'll be discussing the ins and outs today. We have a few learning objectives for today's event. Very quickly, number one, recognize M&A transaction types and integration approaches. Number two, identify M&A infrastructure challenges and potential benefits of cloud-based solutions. Number three, understand architecture strategies to leverage cloud solutions. And number four, list criteria that may limit the potential deployment of cloud solutions. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today. We've got a few quick notes to go through before we start up, though. First off, slides are available right now under handouts in your GoToWebinar control panel. To get that control panel to the top of your desktop, you might need to click on the blue flower-like icon in your applications area. That'll pull it up to the top. And then towards the bottom of that control panel, you'll see the word handouts. You might have to hit the plus next to that. You can download the PDF right there. Also, within the next 24 hours, we will send you an email with a link to a download of the handouts and also to the recording of this webinar, which we are making right now. We are offering CPE for today's event. If you have interest in CPE, please answer all three polling questions and remain for the duration of the hour-long event. CPE credits are awarded within 24 hours, and you can find them in your My CPE zone in your profile at proformative.com. If you have any questions at all, simply email cpe@proformative.com, and we will take care of you immediately. We would like to make this an interactive event. If you have any questions at any time, please ask them, once again, via the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you take a quick gander at that control panel again, you'll see an area called Questions. You can hit us up at any time. We've got some great subject matter experts joining us today, so this is a fantastic opportunity to ask them your questions. Finally, at the tail end of the event, if you would do us the great favor of staying on for an additional minute, we will present you with a short survey. It's very useful for providing us feedback. Also, if you would like to be connected with either of our speakers or with our sponsor, NetSuite, you can simply let us know with a click of a mouse right there. All right, so that's it for preamble. Let's go ahead and get into the fun stuff, the reason we're all here today, which is to talk about the impact of the cloud in M&A. We've got two speakers joining us today, and I'll introduce the second one first, Christopher McCormick, Senior Manager at Deloitte Consulting. Chris has over 20 years of experience in consulting, information technology, and operations management in multiple sectors. He has worked with clients across various industries, including manufacturing, distribution, financial services, aerospace, defense, and public utilities. Also joining us today and kicking us off is David Moore, who's a principal with Deloitte Consulting. David has more than 30 years of experience applying technology across multiple industries. His focus is on delivering large, complex technology projects and has extensive experience with implementation, integration, and testing projects for some of Deloitte's most complex clients. Well, Christopher and David, thanks so much for joining us today. And David, I know you're kicking us off, so please do so, and welcome.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. Today we really want to talk about the challenges of M&A. In the last 2 years, we've seen a record-setting a number of transactions in regards to mergers and acquisitions, and 2016 has every indication to continue this trend. And anybody who's ever been through an acquisition or divestiture can attest these transactions are very complex and present many challenges to the people involved. But on the positive side, they provide an opportunity to change your competitive landscape and really change the game. So when you go into a mergers and acquisition event, you really need to think through and plan for how do you deliver the benefits while integrating the systems, the clients, your personnel, and the processes across these. and also focusing on building the strategic platforms. And all this while not impacting your clients and your employees and your financial performance. Really the goal of this is it's quite complex and there's a lot going on in a quick period of time, but you're trying to capture, streamlining the processes, streamlining your organization in order to get either growth or cost reduced as you go through this process. And really just focusing on maintaining your current business momentum as you try to achieve the goals that you've laid out. So in today's business environment, we're seeing a lot of these going on, and a lot of what we're really seeing is a lot of divestitures happening. Sometimes this may be for an underperforming unit or a non-core asset, but other times we're really seeing it really to focus on changing the competitive landscape. So if a company is really trying to change who their competitors are, they'll look at divesting out and just carving out a piece of business to really change this, so you don't have to focus on the competitors that follow the rest of the business. We've been involved in quite a few this past year that have been doing this and actually very successful. So one of the things you need to look at really is divestitures are quite complex. So you're trying to untangle business processes that may not be related to the core business of the group that's involved. That may be tied to other pieces of the business. So how do you do that? And this is all being done on a very aggressive timeline. The next thing you need to look at is typically what you'll see are TSAs or transition service agreements are put in place. So it's not practical that day one when you do a divestiture or do an acquisition that the systems are all in place for that. So typically what you'll look at is the business that's selling will provide services around systems and processes for a period of time. And it's usually in your benefit to get out of these as quick as you can. But these things are very structurally placed in and contractually placed that it makes it quite complex. But it gives you, pieces of business to continue on while you're setting up the new processes and systems in place. The other thing is just the pressure that's involved. So there's quite a bit of pressure on both sides to get rid of these TSA agreements and basically to shed out the system so that you're basically standing up on your own and can move forward with the new environment, and really focusing on the benefits that you're trying to achieve with this acquisition or this carve out. One of the things you can look at when you go through this is technology is really the primary cost when you look at doing these type of events, and it's the place really that where you can get the most synergies. So if you can really focus on getting the systems in place, that'll greatly benefit getting the processes set up in order to achieve the goals that you're setting up. So one of the right places to look at is basically around the back office of the ERP system. And so one of the things you want to look at is how do you do this quickly? Because most people that have done ERP implementations in the past know these can be multi-year projects, quite complicated. So one of the things that has come about recently, so I would say in the last 5-6 years, is really the advent of cloud-based packages. And these allow you to basically take standard processes and move forward with them. So it's a much faster approach to getting a system in place, and actually provides much more value quickly. And really what you're trying to do is really get to speed the value on these things. And so what this will let you do is really right-size the operating model, but also modernize. So the cloud systems basically at this point are replacing things that were created back in the 80s and 90s if you look at most ERP packages. So these are more modern, more scalable, and basically allow you to do more things quickly. And the other part of this is really, like I was saying, was the speed to value. It really focus on a quicker stand-up to really get your structure in place, because at this point you're really not having to put in infrastructure in those pieces. That's all based on a subscription model. You should go through and look at this. You look at packages that have done this in the past, like the Salesforce.com, Workday, NetSuite, those sort of things. And there's quite a bit there. We're also seeing Oracle and SAP, working quickly to get their cloud packages lined up as well. The next piece with this is if you use an ERP package like a NetSuite or one of these, you're basically can reduce the pressure on the TSA, so you can get up a practical solution quickly and get off of the hosted solutions. And so this really should have a lot of appeal to both your buyer and the seller. So John, let's bring up the first polling question.
Let's do that. So first polling question is coming up right now. As with all polling questions, I'll leave it up for 30 seconds, so you've got plenty of time to get your answer in. This is a quick and easy one. Have you been part of an M&A transaction? Note this is not a test question. This is to help us understand who's in the audience, and that will help our speakers today make sure they're hitting the right points for everyone. We ask that everyone throw their 2 cents in here. All the answers are anonymized, so no one will know what your response is, but we'd love to hear from everyone today. I'll leave this out for another 5 seconds just to make sure we get the last few votes in. And then what I'll do is close that down and share it out. Let's take a look at the results here. And David, well, we seem to have a majority of folks here who have taken part. What do you think about this spread of M&A participation?
No, it's about what I expected. We're seeing more and more deals being done, especially in the last 2 years. I would say, right before the recession in 2007, 2008, we were having a record number of transactions happen, and then it really started moving away from that. But in the last 2 years, the activity has really picked up, and it's really taken off again. So, and it looks like, from all indications, for what we're seeing within the firm, is 2016 is probably going to be the largest number of transactions we've ever seen.
Wow. Interesting. All right, great. Well, we're transitioning now over to Chris McCormick. So, Chris, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having us. So, to carry on from what David was saying earlier, so from the transaction perspective, divestitures and acquisitions actually make up the largest chunk of the M&A activity. I mean, we hear about mergers, but the reality of it is that from the standpoint of just the volume and the number, we see those acquisitions as well as, there we go, the transaction types. And when you think of an acquisition, you have to think of a divestiture. And really all divestiture is a disposition, the sale of an asset. And the reasons for that, sort of similar to what Dave was saying before, is, more often than not, Wall Street is asking companies to focus on their core assets, do what's strategic to their business, and anything that's not strategic, essentially get rid of it. So as you see, these companies are focusing on that, but there's also other reasons, for divestitures and acquisitions that are ongoing. A company I previously worked for is, made a strategic decision to focus on products instead of services. But in order to buy a platform that they need to generate the products, they're actually selling one of their services units to generate the capital to do so. In addition, and other reasons that we see if our business units are underperforming. Another reason, though, and this is, we see this once, periodically, really, is unlocking value. A project that David and I are currently working on, the entity that was spun off was part of a business unit that had a regulatory aspect to their business. And while that business unit was providing services that were supporting their strategy, I mean, it was fundamentally just a support. And the regulatory environment they were in really didn't need to pertain to that business. So what they wound up doing was creating a joint venture and spinning them off, and really hoping to see more value, primarily from the fact that they're no longer in that regulatory environment. The last thing we see is really from an antitrust perspective. So, as you think about telecom companies, or you think about cable companies, as they're merging and coming together, the Department of Justice will look at, in the United States, will look at those transactions to say, hey, are there any monopoly type of things that they need to be concerned about? And what you'll see there is you'll see that they'll either ask them to spin off the assets, or in some cases they'll actually make trades with other entities in order to realign their portfolios, so that from that monopoly standpoint, it looks better to the Department of Justice. All right. John, I'm trying to scroll down and it's, oh, there we go. Thank you.
Sorry, a little latency there.
Okay. Thank you. So, what we want to show here is really from the perspective of, there we go, it is latency. From the perspective of what exactly is the process that companies go through to execute or determine whether they're going to either acquire or divest a company or an entity. There we go, hopefully we stay. So, essentially the company will start out, they'll do their strategic plan, understand what their objectives are. They'll then do a portfolio analysis to understand, what do they have, what are the things that are crucial to supporting their strategy, and then based on that, they'll analyze all the individual business units within that portfolio or assets within that portfolio, and then make the decision. It says, does it fit, does it not fit? If it doesn't fit, what's our divestiture strategy, or what's our plan in the long term to either keep it or potentially, put it out of business over time? Because clearly more mature businesses, based on their technologies, they could be coming to their end of life. And then they'll make that execution decision, and then fundamentally at the end of the day, they now will have this new portfolio, and so the acquisitions and divestitures will all occur, and then the cycle will just repeat itself over time. So from the divestiture standpoint, there's really multiple types of activities or transactions that could occur. Could be a sell-off. So, business unit doesn't fit with the strategic plan, it's going to be sold off, and then someone, another entity will come and acquire it. It could be a spin-off. So in the case that I gave earlier, the project David and I are working on, they essentially spun off that business unit so that it could run by itself and unlock the value that they're hoping to see. Asset trades, similar to what I said about the monopoly, especially in the areas of customer and other types of coverage amongst telecoms. Public utilities is another good example. Sometimes when companies are essentially looking at the value that Wall Street's given their company, and they'll think that, or believe that there's more value out there, you'll see them do a management buyout, and it's more often to take a public company private so than anything else. And then the last is, we'll see sometimes total liquidation. So in the case of bankruptcy, there's a court order in place, the stakeholders and the debt holders need to get paid out, and essentially they'll just liquidate all of the assets from that standpoint. So the next couple of slides that I'm going to talk through is, as you think about now, we talked about divestitures, we talked about different types of transactions, but for each of these, there's a couple of integration approaches that you can take to, either merge or pull these acquired companies together. And so the first one that I'm going to show here is what we call assimilation. And in this case, company A essentially bought company B. And their goal to integrate them is essentially to say, company B is going to be brought in, they're going to leverage company A's processes, systems, etc. And the real goal here is, to come out with a bigger company. And, there's a whole host of reasons they could have bought them. Could have been from a technology need, access to markets, etc. And from a business goal perspective in doing the transaction, this is actually the easiest path. So when you hear the synergy, comments that always come up in how companies, 1 + 1 will be 3, this is really your easiest path to achieve those targets. So company A is essentially going to absorb company B and continue on. The next type is metamorphosis. And this is one where company A and company B are now coming together, and they're essentially going to take the best of each company to build out, this new company. So if company A is the acquirer, company A still may be there. It could be primarily their infrastructure, but they're actually taking all the good things from the acquired company. So as they now look at it, it's more of a hybrid type of approach. And as you look at this, and this, this is truly your best path from a synergy standpoint. And the reason, being simple, that, we're taking the best from each entity. The next type is a transformation. And so in this case, this is where company A and company B are coming together, but the real goal here is we're going to have almost fundamentally a completely new company. You see this in the case where you have more mature companies, their technology may be coming to an end, and they go and they acquire a new company, for the infusion that they need to keep going. So, for instance, if you think back for a company that's been in place for, 20 or 30 years and their infrastructure is that old, well, today's environment, today's business world, we see, social media is huge now. And companies, previous brick and mortar companies, now, they need to have all that infrastructure to understand that, what's happening, we call it now the tweet to cash process. Someone shows up, they start tweeting about what's going on, and how do we track everything through that? That's a major fundamental change from companies, that were essentially built out, in the 80s, 90s, or even early 2000s. And so, when we see this, this is really one where the focus on execution becomes such that, this company has recognized that they need to fundamentally change their business. And, and to give you an example of that, if you look at Apple and just the transformation that they've had over years, and that's not necessarily been through acquisition, but it's been from the fact of, they started out as a PC company. But now today, when you think of them, everyone they have the iPad, the iPhone, the PCs, and it's the whole ecosystem around their products. Their transformation has been pretty significant, and that's essentially the goal in this type of an integration approach. Retention is one where, and you really see this more in the private equity world, where they're buying, a group of businesses to build out a portfolio, and their goal here is to buy the company, essentially leave it alone and let it continue to run, but they're going to provide the management over the top and the governance to make sure that the targets are being hit, the performance issues are being hit, et cetera, and expectations are in alignment. And this one, what we really see more so here is this one is really more about communication going back and forth, and how is that company going to fit in at a top level, not so much at the actual operating or the lower levels. And so, pulling everything together, and from this chart perspective, what I really want to cover here is the second row, which is technology. And to talk through for each of them, really the approach now from a cloud or just an IT perspective. So in an assimilation type of transaction, it's really all about data conversion. So when company A wants to acquire company B, and they're essentially going to make company B, run their systems, run their processes as the means to execute the new company. In this case, what we're really looking at is how do we get all of the data out of the acquired company into the parent company, and that's really what we want to take a look at. And if you're thinking about a cloud solution or a technology solution really of any type, from a cloud perspective, it's more around what's called an iPaaS, an integration platform as a service solution. In this case, essentially the solution in place is meant to help enable that data conversion. How do I get all the data out? And enable you to put a technology in place that is frankly independent of both systems, so that you're able to, and it's totally geared towards, having application interfaces to make that transition as easy as possible. From a metamorphosis perspective, this is all about systems integration. So this is where company A and company B are coming together, and we're taking the best of both worlds. So in this case, you're not only going to need that iPaaS, but you're more often than not going to be looking at individual solutions to make a determination of, hey, offerings out there that we may or may not want to pull in as part of this transaction. Especially in the case, as David mentioned earlier about companies that have systems that are were built in the 80s, 90s, et cetera. For those outdated systems, this is an ideal time to take a look across the board to say, okay, so we want the best of both worlds, but sometimes the best of both worlds, you're just having to make a bad decision. And so if you have to make a bad choice, this is where you can really look at it and say, okay, so what's new that's out there today? And in addition, can we actually do any type of technology transformation as well as part of this activity? The transformational type, again, this is where company A is buying company B, and their goal is to have a new type of company, transforming it. That is really all about architecture as a whole. Just think about your entire IT infrastructure, frankly, your entire business and operating infrastructure. And what are the key things now to execute your business strategy that really need to be in place? And so as they're going forward and they're looking at this, you could be looking at systems, completely across the board, from finance to distribution, manufacturing, HR. I mean, pretty much everything is in play at that point. But the key, as you're going through and you're looking at that architecture is, understanding, how is this all going to fit together? How are we going to make this transformation occur, and how is this going to happen over time, and how's it going to be done in a way such that the systems are able to enable the business and strategic goals that we want to achieve. And then the last one comes back to retention. From a system standpoint, this is the one that probably has potentially the least amount. There could be cases where, a private equity firm snaps up a company and, they get it more on the cheap because they recognize that, hey, they need new processes, they need new technologies. And I would argue in that case, they kind of go more towards the transformational side. And you'll see, where you need to deploy new solutions to get that business where it needs to be. But more often than not, if the company, executes the way it needs to, has solid technology in place, has a good leadership team in place, they're generally going to leave them alone, short of the fact of, giving them their targets and providing that top-level governance and management piece. And really, as I said earlier, it comes back to the communications up and down to make sure that everyone understands, what's happening. From a technology, and a cloud piece, this is one where you'll definitely see less than you will in the other three. All right, John, we are at our next polling question.
We sure are. So let's go ahead and launch polling question number 2. And as last time, we'll leave this off for 30 seconds. The question here is, have you ever participated in technology selection? So another quick and easy question for you there. I'll remind folks you can ask questions at any time, and we'll do our best to get to them during the Q&A portion of today's event, which will come up after the prepared presentation slides. We'll leave this open for another 5 seconds just to make sure everyone gets their vote in. And let's do what we did last time. We'll close it out, share the results, and Chris, here we go.
Yeah, no, this is great. And so, we see more and more we see the technology changing, and especially now the different cloud offerings, especially, there's more of an interest, I'll say, on the finance side as well, due to the fact that we know that the cloud solutions really have an impact across the board. And because the infrastructure piece becomes less important, if you will, it becomes much more about the functionality, and it becomes much more about the impact to the business. So this is great. All right, so as I continue through the next part, so we covered, talked about the M&A types of transactions, talked about the types of integration that you see from a company perspective. And, what I want to talk about now is if you go through those transactions, you're in the midst of one, and even if you're midst of your day-to-day, regular business, right? If you're looking at a cloud solution, just what are some of the criteria that you should be considering, as you do so? So, see. There we go. The first piece here is to really conduct a thorough vendor analysis, and beyond just the product, there are a couple of key things here that I'm going to uncover so we can talk about first, which are the vendors have different approaches to their products and different management styles, as well as release upgrades and paths such as that. And it's really important that, once you've identified a product, you think, okay, from a functional standpoint, it's going to fit, and you're comfortable there. The vendor understanding and how they're managing their technology, you really want to understand how that fits with what you are trying to achieve. And so from a vendor perspective, there's really 2 types of vendors. There's what we call a pure play, cloud provider. That's a vendor that is basically grown up in the cloud. So their product has always been a cloud product. They don't even offer on-premise solutions in most cases. And then on the flip side, and NetSuite as an example is a pure play cloud provider. On the flip side, you have your on-premise providers. So if you think about the companies that have been in place, frankly, for an extended period of time in the financial space, if I look at the SAPs, the Oracles of the world, that's where they grew up, because that's, if you go back 20 years ago, that was what we had. Everything was primarily on-premise. And so now, you're seeing that these on-premise vendors, they're slowly moving into the cloud space. And as, you're evaluating your vendors, what is really key to understand is, your release cycles are a lot different. And that typical, on-premise solution, the way it worked previously was you would go, you would deploy, the solution would be there, and then, every couple of years they would have a new release. And then it was really your decision on, if you had done the implementation, especially in a case where you had significant customization done, you may not choose to upgrade for a number of years. And in some cases, I've seen companies that wouldn't upgrade until basically the vendor, said they would no longer support the release they were on. But that decision, you had a lot more control, a lot more say on that upgrade cycle. With cloud providers, more often than not, you're given some leeway with regards to your release, and they'll essentially put a window out there, and you can pick where you want to be in the window, but the reality of it is it's usually not more than a couple of months for that window, and they want everyone to be on the same version of their software. And the reason is they're rolling out, and typically you're seeing 2 releases or 2 upgrades a year. And the cloud solutions are constantly adding functionality to their products. And as such, their customers have more of a licensing model. And as part of that license, you get the software and you get the upgrades for free. So maintaining and being within that release cycle and understanding that cycle, can be critical, especially upfront from an implementation standpoint. Because if you have a vendor that is going to force you on an upgrade path, and now that upgrade path conflicts with your, say, implementation or your deployment, especially if a multi-phase or multi-wave deployment, that is really important to know. The project David and I worked on, we actually had 2 upgrades in the middle of our deployment. We went basically at 4 phases or 4 waves of countries that we rolled out to. And we needed to manage that, and the vendor was great. The vendor worked with us to do that, and I can tell you the upgrade path is just very different. Not having to worry about the hardware makes it a little bit easier, but at the same point in time, you still have the same types of issues that you need to be aware of. Another key thing that you want to consider too, especially when you're in the midst of an M&A transaction, you want to buy for the present. One of the sayings that you'll hear is, companies will say, transition then transform, and really one of the goals of cloud is, can we get you to transition and transform at the same time? That's really one of our goals from an M&A perspective. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, as David was saying, when you need to get off of your TSAs, and the TSAs the penalties can be very, very harsh. I've seen cases where the TSA penalties actually exceed the cost of the project themselves, from like if you're, for doing implementations, building out infrastructure, et cetera. And in these cases, you need to be very aware of, as you're buying and you're evaluating your solution, you always want to have the end game in mind. Don't get me wrong. We want to strategically look at it to say, if I'm going to need this functionality over time, I really want to get that, and pay for that today. But especially when you're in the midst of this M&A piece, and if you're trying to bring companies on board and there's a lot of pressure, a lot of timelines that have to be hit, realistically, look at what you're doing today, and then more importantly as well, try to keep it simple. I can tell you on the project that we worked, one of our mantras was leverage out of the box where you can. It doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to do so. That's just reality. But where you can go, the majority of the cloud solutions today, they are built upon leading practices. And especially in a case of like financial systems, as you look at like GL, accounts payable, accounts receivable types of processes, the processes are generally pretty consistent across industries even. And so when you look at that process, if you know you're going to be selecting a vendor, that leading practices have been built in, then do your best to use those practices. Because yet again, when you're in the midst of that transaction and all the pressure and all the timelines are there that need to be hit, keeping it simple really does, it helps with training, it helps with your change management, and it helps with your communication across all of your entities. And it really helps to, kind of relieve some of that pressure that you're seeing as part of the transaction, especially during your implementation. Okay, this looks like a little simple slide, but I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time talking about this one. A two-tier strategy, for those who have not heard of it, is one where, when corporations have a large ERP system, you look at the Fortune 100, and they're running something like an SAP as an example for their entire organization. They've made a large investment in that, and so on a new entity, they really are facing a couple of alternatives. They could bring in the new company, they could, line up their business units and figure out, hey, how are we going to deploy our current corporate systems or our current operating systems to these new entities. Okay, and it could be cost prohibitive, it could be also a timing issue with regards to the actual transaction itself. And so what we're starting to see more is when these types of transactions are occurring, instead of just immediately trying to figure out how to get them onto their corporate system, they're actually looking, at can they use a cloud-based system to get the company stood up, get it in place so that the company can run, and I'll use financials as an example. You can get the financials up and running, the business is going, and now instead of being concerned about, how am I going to roll out SAP to all these new potentially lines of businesses or operating sites, now you become more concerned about, well, how do I, how do I get my cloud solution deployed? And having no infrastructure, significantly helps to speed up that time. But now, more importantly, it becomes a question of, well, how do I integrate so that I can consolidate up into my corporate system and I can generate my financials, as well as be able to do top-level entries, and roll it back down to the individual lines of business or business units. And that integration, in today's world, is pretty commonplace. We see many companies that will utilize, solutions such as Hyperion to do their consolidation, and the consolidations up and down, amongst entities, is really a transaction type that we've been doing that now for years. And to do that integration versus to figure out, how to deploy, a complicated system, across business entities, sometimes it makes more sense to go with the more simple solution and just integrate it upwards. So another piece is you're considering a cloud alternative or cloud solution. A key piece here too is you really want to decouple that selection from your infrastructure that may be going on. So as I said before, the project Dave and I have been working on with the spinoff. Well, there was a data center stand-up that needed to occur as part of this project, and while I can't say it didn't affect us at all, I will simply say it was very minimal with regards to our project. Whereas if our client had deployed an on-premise solution, well, that on-premise solution is very, very dependent upon that data center stand-up because the hardware needs to sit somewhere, it needs to operate, it needs to run. Whereas by deploying a cloud solution, we're able to monitor that data center stand-up project, make sure that, see what's going on, and in cases where we need to, frankly, integrate with an on-prem solution, understand the timing and make sure that everything, works as fluidly as possible. It's not really a means to an end for a cloud solution. So as you're considering it, you really want to decouple those cloud solutions and make sure that you're not evaluating them in the context of your entire overall infrastructure, because you may be taking things into consideration that frankly you don't need to whatsoever. Another piece that you really want to evaluate is you want to look at your data conversion and you want to look at your transaction volumes. This is really huge because this could actually, as I mentioned, iPaaS before, so integration platform as a service. Well, if you need to do tens, hundreds of millions in transactions at a time, it may make sense that you actually run that platform on premise, simply from a volume perspective and from just a transaction and amount of time to execute perspective. That does, we have seen that in the past. And so, as you're evaluating it, you decouple that, but more importantly, and even on the side from the perspective of understanding, what do you need to push through the system, and working with the vendors to understand, what are their expectations and what can they accept and what are they expecting from a response time perspective. Because, while the cloud providers, they're in world-class data centers, Okay, and you're going to see, they'll have SLAs that will be very similar to what you're used to seeing from, your current IT providers, where, you're 99.5% availability, those types of things. That'll be there. But what you really want to kind of make sure that you're evaluating, yet again, is that throughput of the system. Okay, once you start hitting, millions of transactions, you really want to make sure that, you're evaluating it, you're doing testing, and you're getting the quals, frankly, that you're confident that, when you put the system in place, that it's going to do exactly what you needed to do from that standpoint. And then, the one big piece here from an ecosystem perspective is you cannot forget about the third-party add-ons. It's really, as you think, I have an iPhone. As I look at my iPhone, and I can go in and I can pick all the different apps and do what I want to do. And a lot of the cloud solutions and the cloud providers that you see, they have built out similar ecosystems. And so, in cases where you'll see a financial system, well, they might have a bolt-on to do certain things such as tax or doing reconciliation. If you're a large company, and especially when you're doing top-level transactions, you need to monitor and make sure that both sides of the transaction are still in balance. So from a reconciliation standpoint, there are systems out there that handle that. Business intelligence and data warehousing, the iPads that I mentioned previously. HR systems is another big, especially from a financial system standpoint. And so, as you go through all these systems and you're evaluating the individual solution, make sure that, as you're looking holistically to say, what's your goal, what's your strategy, what's all the functionality that you need. It may not necessarily all exist in one solution per se, but if you look at their entire ecosystem and you look at what they've built out and who they've partnered with, a lot of these systems, they're literally, it's a bolt-on, and it's minimal amount of time. So to give you an example, from a payment gateway perspective, we deployed a financial system. They had a preferred provider. About 6 months into the project, we realized we needed a payment gateway. We had it up and running in a week. That's the kind of thing. But the only reason we were able to do that, yet again, to be clear, is it was part of their entire solution, if you will, and that payment gateway, was pretty much geared to work with their product already. So we were able to go add it onto our solution and boom, keep running. And then the last piece really is really understanding what are all the price drivers. And so you've looked at the different solutions, you've done your functional analysis, you're happy that you think it's going to meet your needs, and hopefully you're down to a few different options that you can look at. And so as you go through and you look at the drivers, licensing will play a big part of that. As we go, how many users that you have, and the users, they will typically get priced into tiers. And I can tell you that one thing that we have seen, as we go, is the user numbers, because they really do drive the cost. We are seeing vendors who are actually offering unlimited users now. Your transaction volumes and the data through the system, that is really huge. And actually, let me take a step back here. As you think about your price drivers, and if you think about from a cloud perspective, what are their concerns? Okay, so kind of turn this around a little bit. The cloud companies, and the drivers that we're going to show here, they're providing the infrastructure for their product. So, as the customer, really all you need is connection to an internet, you need a browser. That's really kind of it. And so, but from the price perspective, where they're going to have different price points and different, add-ons to price is really going to be around the areas where they have to do, say, additional maintenance, or they have to add hardware. Those are the things that for them, where they're going to, the vendor's going to look at that to say, okay, so if I need to add this, well, there's a cost to that, and then they're going to ultimately want to push that cost, back to their client. So, users are one. Transaction volumes, will dictate, how many, what's the database look like, what's the sizing look like. Can you run on your own do you need to run on your own individual hardware, or can the data center be set up so you're just a virtual server? And I have one server set up, and it's really got 3 or 4 companies running on it. That's a completely different animal there. The functionality. Core functionality is typically there, but then the vendors will have, packages, if you will. It's, I kind of look at it like, when I buy my cable services, I get my cable out of the box, and then if I want to add, the different, HBOs and those types of things or other packages, I'll do so. It's very similar from a functionality standpoint for a lot of the cloud providers. Some cases we've seen where, the provider will actually talk to the company and, basically using their revenue as a driver of cost. And so that way, if you're small when you begin and you don't have much revenue, the cost will be low. But as you grow, they expect to be able to charge you more. And then the number of legal entities. And this really fundamentally comes back to, how many instances. And by instance, I mean, think of a database. Do I need one or do I need multiple? In the case of where, I have, let's say I have one company and I have multiple subsidiaries. Well, in this case, I can probably just have one instance of the software, if you will, and I'll have all the subsidiaries stood up within one instance. In the case, however, where, say, I have the private equity firm and they've bought, 2 or 3 companies, and that's now part of their portfolio, and they want those companies to remain independent. Well, in this case, I probably need an entire instance of the software for each business unit that the private equity firm now owns. Those are 2 different things. And in the case where I need to have 3, I'm going to have, maintenance and other costs associated with that. And thus, from a legal entity standpoint, there is more overhead, and the vendors are going to expect to charge you more for that. So from a the cloud perspective, and as you're looking at the cloud systems, one thing that we did want to make sure we cover too is, cloud isn't always the answer. I mean, trust me, David and I would love for it to be. That's what we do. But the reality of it is, as well, is there are cases where, you get in, you start to look at your requirements, you look at the functionality needed, you look at the overall fit for the business, and it just simply may not be. And, the one example I gave before was really around the integration piece, and where, for the deployment we've been working on, we hit a point where we had just a significant volume of data that we were essentially pulling from one system into another. And it just simply made more sense to actually have that integration happen in an on-premise solution for no other reason than the fact that, the data it was coming from is an on-premise system, and it just minimizes a lot of the overhead, with regards, that needs to take place for each type of transaction. So where you see high transaction volumes, they can exceed cloud capabilities, simply because if you think about the pipe that's going out, you're trying to push all that data through, and sometimes it's just easier for it to be done on premise. But as you're doing so, a couple of key things are you really want to work with your vendor. I mean, I can tell you, as part of our project, we were working, hand in hand with our vendor throughout the project to understand, what exactly can the system and how much throughput do we need in order to execute. And this just covers, as I said, multiple instances can be used to alleviate some of that. I know of one client who split their business up such that the U.S. was 60% of their business. That part stayed on one instance of the software. All the other countries actually stayed on the other, and that allowed them, from that standpoint, to mitigate the volume issues that they were having. So there are things that can be done as you look at the volumes. Another piece, as I said earlier, subscriptions can get costly. And we are seeing more and more where cloud providers are saying, hey, we will give you an unlimited user package, but it's pretty pricey. I mean, I will tell you, they're building into the fact that they're going to have unlimited users, and so having that versus not having it, you can see 2 very different sets of pricing if you give them a user count versus just say, I want to have as many as I want. And then storage is not free. So if you need, as part of your business, if you need to have additional types of data associated with the various transactions. So for instance, let's just say I need engineering specs, and I need to store the specs, and I want to email them as part of any invoicing I do. Well, those specs take up space. And so, in addition to the database that you have, for all of your transactions, cloud providers will give you, space around that so you can store stuff like that. But there is a cost to it. And especially when you want to store lots of information. And if you want to store it for a period of time, you need 7 or more years of data and you're starting to hit terabytes of space, the cloud providers are going to want to get paid for that. Back to what I said previously, where they're worried about their hardware, their maintenance costs internally. And when you start to affect that, that's where you start to see that the prices go up. So I wanted to cover, from a case study perspective, really, project that we've been working. And so, in this case, and I've been talking about it throughout, but, it's a spinoff from their parent organization that occurred. The company and the client decided they were going to do a completely pure cloud strategy. So their entire infrastructure, they were really trying to achieve as much cloud, solutions as possible to minimize that infrastructure need. They had transition service agreements in place, and there were severe financial penalties. In the one case on the transition, the penalty exceeded the cost of our project. It was very interesting. And the TSAs, they're really there to push the companies along, to get them, in this case, the company that needs to stand up now on its own. It really kind of pushes you to stand up on your own. That's really the purpose. Prior to this, they solely had on-premise solutions. They had more than 10 unique financial systems in place. And as part of the project, we had to be deployed in more than 25 countries. And the goals throughout this project were, minimize the TSA costs, get everybody onto one system, executing the same types of processes. So, as you think about this and you think about the M&A activity, there's just a ton of pressure on this as part of this project because things need to be done quickly. There are penalties if they're not. And as we're bringing on a cloud solution, they had previously been used to on-premise solutions, and there's a lot of change management and communications that just simply need to occur in order to make that happen. And one of the things that we really did as part of this, and as you're looking at your cloud solutions, especially if you need a global deployment or just a multiple business unit deployment, we took the time up front to build just a common operating model. So how do you expect those cloud solutions to work? How do you expect them to fit in with all the other solutions? And especially in this case where we needed to go to multiple countries, having that essentially blueprint built up front and having a common design based on, frankly, the system's leading practices, the company's best practices, and having it fit, their specific needs. Building all of that, understanding how everything fit together and how the cloud offering was going to, generate or provide the benefits they need, really helped immensely with this project. And some of the key lessons learned as we go, really, one is, recognizing in some cases, that cloud solution, may not always be the right fit. And I gave a couple examples of that previously. Performing all that upfront analysis. I cannot stress enough the work we did up front, especially on the design side as part of that project, really helped us just to simply understand how everything was going to fit together, how we were going to hit our dates, and what were all the things that we need to do, to balance the needs of the activity of the transaction that was going on, as well as how are we going to provide the benefits long term, so that there were things we needed to do to go live quickly, but there are also benefits that we need to achieve longer term. And then working with the IT team. We were hand in glove with their both the client IT team as well as the vendor IT team, and we all worked together to make sure that everything fit within that current architecture. And then from an overall project standpoint, I can never say this enough, just communicate. Can't say it enough. As David was showing earlier with, it was the second slide where you see, just all the things that need to be balanced as part of any M&A activity. It's just huge. And, your project individually, may work just fine, but when you take it into the context of everything else that's going on, there could be ramifications down the road that you need to understand, and communicating makes all that happen and gets more insight quickly. Change management has been huge. Just simply from a training standpoint, overall project communications, getting the employees and getting everyone comfortable with the messaging of what's going on, why are we doing things. Really, can't say enough there. And then the last is be flexible. As part of our project plan, when we built our project plan initially, the entity used to be part of a regulated company. Their thought process was, you gave me a project plan, this is the plan, we're going to execute to it, and that's kind of it. But the reality of it is, with so much stuff going on, the only thing, and I said this to our client up front, the only thing I can tell you with certainty is our project plan will change. and the reason is there's so much stuff going on that, in order to take it all into account, you had to be flexible, which we, and really act as one team to get everything done. And those things, as we went through this, is really what has allowed us to be, as successful as we've been. So that's our disclosure. So, thank you, everybody. I'm John. I, turn this back over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Great, a lot of ground covered there. And we only have time for a few questions here. And we have some questions, although feel free to continue asking away, and we'll do our best to get to them here in the next couple of minutes. So, Chris, we'll start off with you here. How do you get your arms around how much bandwidth you're going to need if you've got multiple hundreds or more of users who need to be more or less constantly on a cloud solution?
So from it's really more of a data perspective. You really need to understand, and again, you're going to want to work with your provider to see what are the different means to have that data go through. So, each individual, you're going to look at the different transaction types, you're going to look at the volumes of the transactions, and frankly, the provider will help with that. But understanding those volumes and understanding, what needs to go through is key. And yet again, as you're looking at a cloud solution, think of it as, you need your web browser. So it really becomes how much throughput do you need from your web browser, from your PC or your laptop, et cetera, out to the internet.
Gotcha. Very quickly, David, because we're almost out of time here. Can you just talk to security in the cloud these days? Big concern, not a big concern? Are there many breaches happening, et cetera?
Yeah, so security is always a concern, but I think it's less so now than we've seen in the past. Most customers have had their sales information in the cloud for a while now, and also a lot of the payroll information as well. The vendors do a very good job of security, so you spend time with them on that piece. They do it's amazing the levels of security that they go through. But it's always a concern, but to me, it's equal concern on premise as well. I mean, if you haven't been hacked already, you probably just don't know it. So there's people out there always going at this sort of thing.
Right. Indeed. All right. That's the time we've got for questions. Let's get into our final few housekeeping items. First off, thanks to our speakers, David and Chris. Great job today. Thanks so much for joining us and giving us all the benefit of your insight and experience.
Well, thank you, John. Really appreciate you having us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Absolutely, our pleasure. Please join us at Performative to continue the conversation with your peers in our community. And if you'd like an introduction to today's speakers or our sponsor, NetSuite, please let us know, which is going to be coming your way in just a few moments here. First, let's thank our sponsor, NetSuite, whose commitment to thought leadership in this realm helped us make today's educational webinar possible and delivered at no cost to the participants. So a hearty thanks to NetSuite, a longtime supporter of what we do here at Performative. And we're going to go ahead and jump into our third and final polling question right now. Does your organization utilize cloud technology today? So once again, on the test question, just getting us an idea of who's on the line. Now, we're not going to have time to discuss this as we did the last ones, but I'll shout out the results. 56% yes, 32% no, plus or minus, and then a few I don't knows, which is interesting. But yeah, actually surprisingly a high percentage, almost a third, are not using cloud in their organizations. All right, well, that's it. Thanks so much, folks, for joining us today. We certainly hope to see you again at another Performative event or online at performative.com. We're going to move to shut it all down now. You will be taken straight to the post-event survey. We greatly appreciate you giving us an extra 60 seconds to answer a few quick questions and let us know, importantly, what we could be doing new, different, better next time out. So thanks. Hope to see you soon. Take care, folks.